The 20th century needs a new version of the Fabrica because first we need a version of the Fabrica that emulates the way that Vesalius himself constructed his sentences and explanations. Second, we need a Fabrica that has a degree of transparency. So you can see through the text of the Fabrica and see the sources that lie behind it and the traditions that lie behind it. It's true of any text. We have applied this kind of transparency mostly to literary texts, but we also need to apply it to texts like the Fabrica, so we can see through the surface and see what, for example, Vesalius is gathering from Galen, what he is gathering from later anatomists of his own time, and what spin he is putting on those observations and that information. I would say the peculiarities of the translation are a constant attempt to bring as much as possible of Vesalius' own written style into an English version without the obscurity. It sometimes takes a day to read a sentence of Vesalius, even some of the shorter ones. His Latin is difficult. And I don't try to make the English difficult, but I like to carry some of the periodic structures that are characteristic of his way of writing. Well, first of all, it construes the Latin. It turns the Latin into clear English and into good English, but English that carries the cadence and the way of writing that Vesalius had. So it tries to bring the reader as close as possible to Vesalius without obscuring what he had to say. It's always desirable to bring the reader as close as possible to any author so that we feel we are in direct confrontation with the author. And in translation, that is one of the goals, to bring the reader face to face with the original author. The message of the new Fabrica is that we must see not only what Vesalius wrote, but the history that lies behind what he wrote. What were the components of his thinking? He was at one time very conservative. He tried to be like Galen. He tried to be more Galenic than Galen himself, but he also tried to be a scientist. He tried to be a direct observer. He tried to be a skeptic. He tried to encourage his students and his readers to be skeptical. Who will need the new Fabrica? I think anyone who's interested in the 16th century will need the new Fabrica, because in the 16th century, the interest in science ran very deep. Scientific books, especially illustrated scientific books, were, so to speak, on every coffee table. They were in every library. They were big sellers. They were profitable. And so for everybody in the Renaissance, these books are essential reading because they bring the 16th century into focus. And whenever we try to study a period of time, we try to get as close to its complexity and to its various focal points. This is one of them. Well, there were disparate moments and there were desperate moments in translating Vesalius. The desperate moments in translating would come near the end of the day that I'd spent the whole day trying to figure out a sentence. And the truth did not come. Sometimes I had to put it away until the next day before I could understand a sentence. So those were the desperate moments. There were many of those. The disparate moments came when I was able to read an entire page and have no doubt at all that I understood it correctly and that I could annotate it correctly to provide the transparency that I think readers need to have. So the new Vesalius provides a bridge from the obscurity of the written sentences to the clarity of the translation and notes. I think the common spirit of the original Fabrica and the new Fabrica will be perfectly clear upon reading, that when we read the new Fabrica, we will be able to see back through it to the original. Even though Vesalius often did not reveal his sources, we now see those sources. We hear the voice very clearly, but we also hear the voices that lie behind the voice of Vesalius himself. The second edition, the 1555 edition of the Fabrica, was written a dozen years after the first. He had the opportunity to reconsider what he had said, of course. He had the opportunity to rewrite. I think the spirit is the same. Vesalius started his life, remember he was only 28 years old when he published the first edition, 1543. He writes that one of his wisdom teeth was just coming in at that time. In 1555, he was a dozen years older. He had a much better idea of what his purposes were. He had a more of an educational mission in that he was educating contemporaries and students to look at the body in a new way and to try to see the body in modern eyes and not through the eyes of Galen.